I don't like CN's heritage units. In fact, I kind of hate them. Yeah, I said it. So, around late 2020, Canadian National would release 5 heritage units for their 25th anniversary, alongside a pair of Mother Slug sets. To say that they were a mixed bag would be an understatement. Weird proportions, off colors, and just... no. You could tell the quality control of these units was pretty rough. Even back in 2021, when I was still a teenager, I knew how off CN's heritage units looked. So much so that I decided to make my own versions of what I feel CN's heritage fleet could have been. Now, I should say that these aren't meant to be like the definitive what if, or that I'm fixing something that a railroad company has made. This is more or less just my take on CN's heritage units that I made for fun. So compared to CN's heritage units, of which 5 locomotives were made and 2 slug sets, I decided to make around 15 heritage units on like SD70M-2s. And the reason for this was because there weren't any Tier 4 locomotive models back then. And this was also the closest model available of quality back then, so I had to make do with what I got my hands on. Anyways, let's go over all 15 of them, shall we? Let's start off with the Northeastern Iron Horn coal hauling B&LE. This livery is based on the ones worn by the various diesels, such as the ST38s and more notably the tunnel motors. Looking back, the orange does feel a bit oversaturated, but I did like how this looked, in spite of the fact that the BLE's livery is a bit easy to do, and with very few logos as well. I know some B&LE locomotives did feature the logo on the front, but I chose to base it more on the ones without the nose logo, for some reason. You might have noticed the unique IPO25 logo on the side, which is kinda based on the original 25th anniversary sticker 8952 wore when it was outshopped. And honestly, I prefer this look compared to whatever the real heritage units had. It just looks a lot more clunky in my opinion. My take was to remove the square and just have the 25, to represent 25 years of privatization, and the CN logo intact. It looks a hell of a lot more better than just this. Considering that the B&LE trackage today is mostly ST70M-2s, I can imagine this unit would primarily operate on said trackage alongside the few other EMDs left around their old stomping grounds. But hey, that's just me. Next we have the Duluth-Mesabian Iron Range, the other iron ore railroad CN swiped through its ass. I actually went back and touched up a few of these units with new colors due to how oversaturated or off they originally looked. 8951 was one of the few that I actually touched up, considering that the old shade of red was... yeah. I gotta admit, with the new colors, it looks so much better. And honestly, I like the DMIR's livery, considering that it does look smart with the dark maroon, especially on the diesels. And to think that many of them are repainted in the CN colors does unfortunately suck. But that's the same thing for the majority of fallen flag locomotives. Also, fun fact, when I was looking through the DMIR's roster, considering that they were primarily EMD users, the locomotives that caught me the most off guard were the Union Pacific C630s that were rostered for a brief time in the 70s. And they're sorely some of the more intriguing locomotives on their roster. I won't lie, I'd be curious to see what they'd look like with the maroon colors.
Listen, check it out.
Now this one we know is real, and the first heritage unit everyone witnessed. So aside from the IPO logo being changed, I decided to change the colors to resemble the grunk more closely, considering that the blue they used on the real A952 was more bright, while the real blue was a lot more darker, at least based on the photos that I referenced. Although, when you think about it, many Grand Trunk Western locomotives still in service had their colors become a lot more brighter and faded, or covered in grime. Another change was all the handrails becoming white, which the real 8952 didn't have. And you gotta admit, it really lifts the look of 8952 in my personal opinion. I'd say out of the bunch it's not the worst Heritage units, and it's genuinely surprising how this is the only SC70M-2 that got the Heritage treatment. And it honestly suits the M2 better than what a Tier 4 GEVO can do, to be honest. Maybe it's because the GTW was primarily an EMD user? I don't know. Another simple livery, and among the easiest to make, was the DT&I, otherwise known as the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, which was known for serving the auto industry around Detroit, and, well, those elusive concrete catenary poles. The railroad's livery was basically just orange of DT&I markings, alongside the frames being orange as well. It's my least favorite among the Heritage units, mostly due to how simple and bland it looks in all honesty. I do think the DT&I is a decent fallen flag due to its historical impact, and certainly not because of how Henry Ford installed those concrete catenary towers and whatever. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say on this, but I'm not a huge fan of the colors, and it's kind of a bland scheme at the end of the day for an otherwise goated fallen flag. I'd say 3023 is my favorite out of the CN Heritage units, and it's kind of an interesting one due to the unit being a hybrid of both of the Joliet's liveries. It has the nose logo worn back in the 1970s, but has the stripes on the rear that most of the active units have, first being applied back in the 90s, I think? I decided to base the Heritage unit more on the recent liveries, with the white stripes being on the front like the SC38s. I haven't seen as many EJ&A units throughout my time as a rail fan, although I did see a few of their SC38s though, one of which you could actually see in my Chicago vlog from well over 3 years ago. I do think the EJ&E is an interesting fallen flag, lasting as long as it did compared to other railroads CN unfortunately required, as it survived all the way up until 2009 based on the research I did. Either way, I think 3023 reflects the liveries of the J pretty well with a unique hybrid look, to be honest, and I think my take over here doesn't look as bad. I love the Central Vermont's livery. Something about the colors, the stripes being inverted on the nose, it just looks beautiful. Compared to the other railroads that CN affiliated with the updated liveries, the CV went with the best outcome personally for such an overlooked subsidiary. Looking back at my take of a Central Vermont Heritage unit, I think this one turned out better than I expected, even after 5 years? With the CV logo at the front, the colors looking just right, and how it just screams perfect. And while yes, the CV's livery was only applied to standard cabs and high hoods, but looking back on a wide cab though, holy, it just works so well. Maybe a little too well for comfort. Maybe it could actually work on other locomotives, perhaps. This livery was also a bit easy to make, since it's literally just the GTW livery of different logos. I even went through and redid the colors for 8956, and holy does it make a huge difference. One reason for this could be due to DW&P's connection with Canadian National, seeing as the railway did become a subsidiary for the CNR into the 2010s, which also gave them the privilege of getting new liveries, or more or less just being carbon copies of the CNR's liveries, and even the GTW's liveries for a time. It's certainly interesting to see the liveries of Canadian diesels being applied onto their American counterparts, and it honestly makes a DW&P an interesting niche fallen flag. BC Rail's liveries were gorgeous, and I'll give credit to CN for making 3115 a decent representation of BC Rail, despite the fact that it was CN being the reason why BC Rail died. I like that they based 3115's livery worn by diesels around the late 80s, which was evident with the dual white stripes on the long hood, and just looking pretty clean as shit. And I tried to reflect that on the M2, which I think works to some degree. I did go for a darker blue compared to what the real unit had, which, yeah, looked to be a more brighter blue. Not bad in all honesty, but eh. And honestly, I like that they chose the early red, white, and blue scheme compared to the more simplified version on the 90s worn by the GE Cowls and Canadian Cab-9, since it just almost makes the scheme look a bit empty. And don't even get me started on the plain blue livery. On God, that's mid as shit. So while I was looking at some photos of BC Rail locomotives, a neat observation struck me, and that's pretty much the contrast between how the frames look when they're factory freshed compared to what they look like in their later years. And it's such a fun contrast, especially compared to locomotives that stuck with black frames. Also, just for fun, here's a 15-second edit I made featuring what the locomotive would look like with rock lights. And I don't mean to sound like a foamer, but 3115 would have looked amazing with rock lights. And throw in another beacle, because why not? And who wouldn't pass on a green beacle unit, right? This livery has stuck around with BC Rail since the 70s, and even beforehand during the Pacific Great Eastern days. The scheme would see two-tone green separated with a white line in the middle, before getting white stripes in the early 80s on many hood units like the SC40s and MLWs. I gotta admit, I do like the addition of the stripes since it gives a more finished feel to the livery. Doesn't mean I hate the original ones though. If anything, BC Rail's livery variety is low-key interesting to me, considering that they had some good, some mid, and downright questionable color palette, so to speak. We can't have CN heritage units without resembling the company's roots, right? I decided to make 3 units in different liveries from previous eras, starting with my favorite, sporting the original colors of the CNR. This particular scheme would have been applied to many passenger units, like the F units, the FPA-4s, the C-liners, and the E8s in later years. There is another variant of the green specifically applied to road units, but I settled on the passenger variant mostly because I like the addition of the black, and mostly because the addition of black adds a lot more classiness to the livery in my personal opinion. I'll be honest, I hate how CN tackled this livery on 7600. The livery is decently proportioned, don't get me wrong, but the color palette is just awful. Like, how can CN screw up their own colors? Giving a dark classy livery these rather bright and saturated greens and yellows just looks so wrong. It is interesting though to see that CN slapped heritage colors onto some yard power, like they were making them specifically so they wouldn't be seen often from the general public, since 7600 and 01, the IC heritage set, was always confined to yard service. Either way, I like how I handled the scheme here with more appropriate shades of green and yellow, and it's arguably among my favorites, although admittedly getting the stripe work on the nose is a pain most of the time, considering some of these models' UV maps tend to be weird. The second CN painted one I decided to base on was CN's most beloved paint scheme, the zebra stripes. Yeah, I wish CN did this for one of their heritage units, considering people like the zebra liveries. And it has been applied to a multitude of hood units past and present, and I think it looks a little weird on the SC70M-2, but that's just me. Does anyone remember 8898? How some people consider that as a heritage unit is beyond me. considering it's just a freshly repainted M2 with the IPO sticker slapped on the side. Not a bad repaint, but it barely even qualifies as a heritage unit in the slightest, since it's literally wearing the livery that's still being applied to CN locomotives to this day. Why they never considered applying a variant of the CN scheme is beyond me, but I personally feel like something like the zebra stripes, or even a variant of the logo would do just fine. Hell, what about a specially designed paint scheme? That would have been better than just this. You know, looking back at this, 8898 is just wasted potential, and I would have loved to see if they would have tackled zebra stripes on an M2. The other CN1 is more simple and also an easy one to make, as this is just based on the short-lived North America logo. This was applied during the early 1990s on a few locomotives, namely a few SC40Us and -840CMs, as it was created to represent how they forced themselves into America, acquire other railroads to have trackage into America, such as buying out the Grand Trunk Western and Illinois Central. I don't have a lot to say, but the logo is quite unique to say the least, and I wish CN kept it a bit more longer. Even something like this for 8898 would make it a passable heritage unit. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say, but the scheme was pretty much just the regular CN livery with just the North America logo slapped on the side. That's pretty much it. The next one I've done up is up in Northern Ontario, on the famed Algoma Central Railway, which was known for its Agua Canyon tour train running out of Sault Ste. Marie. The ACR would be acquired by the Wisconsin Central in 1998, and later operate under CN ownership following the Wisconsin Central buyout in 2001. The livery was based upon what the SC40s wore, and the scheme does feel oddly reminiscent of the Delaware and Lackawanna's livery. In fact, I basically just recolored my livery of NS1074, the Lackawanna Heritage unit, with some touch-ups, and thrown the Algoma markings and whatnot. Admittedly, it does feel lazy, but overall, I thought the schemes looked similar enough to the point where it looked like the Algoma was copying the Lackawanna, but I feel like that's not the case. A majority of the Algoma Central's SC40s would later be repainted in Wisconsin Central colors, and when those were sold off the short lines, one of them that caught my eye was number 6006 on the Wisconsin Great Northern, which... yeesh. Illinois Central is literally one of the easiest liveries to recreate in any train simulator, considering it's just one color, slap some logos, and bam, IC. I'd say that CN did tackle this scheme decently on 3008 and 7601. Although most people tend to nitpick about 3008 due to how high the numbers on the hood are way too tall compared to other IC locomotives, which, yeah, I get where people are coming from. 7601 on the other hand is alright, but you gotta admit, you'd rather shoot the real deal than with some faker, although the IC slug goes kinda hard. This one was easy to make, and I did fix the error that 3008 had with the side numbers. Aside from that, yeah, it's the right livery and it wasn't that hard to make. And finally, saving the worst one for last. A964. We can all agree that 3069 is by far the worst among CN's heritage units, and there's no counter arguments to be made. It leaves you wondering, who among the higher-ups approved of this slop? It looks like a livery out of an AI image prompt. Like, what another joke! Yeah, it's pretty clear to say this one certainly needed a redo. I kind of get how they struggled to recreate the Wisconsin Central scheme, considering that it was only worn by standard cabs, and that probably would have been hard to translate on a wide cab. But they painted the livery on its secondhand F45s with no hassle, so what was the deal? Alongside this, like, what? Were they worried about painting over the grills, yet they had no qualms on doing the same to 3115? It's just a bastardly stupid design choice, And I consider 3069 as not only the worst heritage unit on CN, but the worst heritage unit, period. Yes, even worse than CSX's depending on your views of them. I decided to try and replicate the Wisconsin Central scheme without the blunders the real one had, such as the appropriate color palette, the proportions not being too squat, such as, a better sized nose logo and the comically placed stripe on the radiators being removed. And I think it turned out a lot better than anticipated. I don't think it's perfect, but I feel like this would have looked much better and more appealing compared to whatever CN's excuse of a heritage unit would do. I mean, what do you guys think? And it baffles me how CN didn't really take any criticism regarding this and is just keeping this unit in the exact same scheme. Like they think, oh, that's just fine, just keep it as it is. And at the end of the day, CN doesn't really care if it looks like shit. Just so long as the locomotive is making them money and, coddling their shareholders with, stacks of cash, then they don't care about how the heritage units looked. And that's all of them. Do I think these are perfect? No, not at all. And I'll admit, looking back at them, yeah, the colors looked rough, and I wish I would have touched up some of the numbers, randomized the, road numbers for them compared to what CN actually did, and I hope to convert most of these from the dated quick mod system to the train modding system. But that was 2021, and I've improved many of my liveries over time. Again, these aren't meant to be the definitive versions of CN's heritage units, as I have seen people make their own takes of them, which are pretty good all things considered. This video was purely meant to showcase my own takes on CN's polarizing heritage fleet, and how I'd imagined them. And looking back though, in spite of the flaws, I liked how these turned out, and I could only dream of CN's heritage fleet looking something similar to these. I had fun making these, and that's what matters at the end of the day. Anyways, these have been on the Steam Workshop for many years now, which will be linked down below, but I'm hoping one of these days I can convert these locomotives to a new modding system. When that will happen, I don't know. Anyways, that will be all, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care, folks.